Good morning and welcome to session F1, where we're going to talk about the essential features of Tier 2. We'll look focusing on the data, the practices, and the systems associated with it. My name is Heather Hatton, and I am co-presenting with Danielle Starkey. Both of us are from the Missouri Center for School-Wide Positive Behavior Support, and we are happy to have some excellent exemplar presenters with us, Dr. Chris Hubbock and Dr. Holly Broadway from the Fulton Public School Systems. So this morning, just a quick review of our virtual forum expectations. You've seen this slide a few times before. We want to focus in on the fact that we will make extensive use of both chat and polls. So please be prepared to join us and participate and give us some feedback on various questions and other things that we've got planned for you. Having some problems advancing the slide. Danielle, oh, there it goes. Okay, finding your registered sessions in Pathable. We assume that you found the session that you're registered for this morning since you've been able to join us, so congratulations, well done, first thing off the bat. Making sure that you know how as well to navigate your sessions page. All of that stayed the same from yesterday until today. If you're having technical difficulties, you can either message us through chat or go to the help desk on the Pathable app. Again, we'll be using quite a bit of chat and polls and Q&A. If you have questions for us, please feel free to pop those into the Q&A that's associated with the polls for this session in Pathable. As always, be careful of accidentally navigating away from us, so make sure that you keep the browser tab that is your Pathable app open at all times. You can do other things around and behind it, but that tab needs to stay open. And then should you need support, it's always available. Like I said, the help desk is available to you anytime. And as you're working with your teams and considering the information that we're presenting here today, think about how it aligns with your priorities, who in your building could do this work, or in your district, or your state, depending on what level you're working at. Where the responsibility for that work lives, that is particularly important for Tier 2. So there'll be some, if you've not been involved in Tier 2 systems and practices before, you'll see that that gets a little different in terms of where it lives and who's responsible for it compared to Tier 1. What will we have to stop doing to make room for this work, and how will we know whether it's working or not? All right. So this is the first session in your strand today, looking at the Tier 2 strand. We'll look at data, practices, and systems. The other two sessions today will focus more on practices, with one specifically looking at how to adapt some of those to online and virtual environments.
All right, so let's jump right into the content. Heather did a great job orienting you to the session and the technology. She also did some introductions so you know who we are. We also have Dr. Tim Lewis, who's one of the co-directors for the Center on PBIS and the director at our MU Center, who's going to be monitoring chat and polls. So if you've got a question, drop it in the polls and he'll make sure to prompt us as we go through. Here are our session outcomes for our session today. We have a lot of content that we're hoping to cover in 75 minutes. So our first goal is that we're going to help you understand the rationale for Tier 2 implementation. And with that, talk about what does appropriate Tier 2 implementation look like, and how do we know when we're ready to implement or start to build Tier 2 systems. We'll talk briefly about how we select Tier 2 practices. When Heather did our quick forum strand overview, the next two sessions are going to focus exclusively on practices. So we're really going to lean heavy in this session on data and systems, but we'll talk briefly about making sure we're selecting high quality practices. We'll talk a little more extensively about database decision making at Tier 2, and how do we make sure we're creating the supports necessary to make sure that our implementation is effective. So you know a little bit about us and the overall session outcomes. If you get a chance, click over to polls. We have one poll in there for you, and it's a little for us to get to know you. And so it's about what's your current implementation phase for Tier 2 when we look at phases of implementation. So maybe you're just exploring tier 2. You haven't really implemented yet, or you are thinking about installing some of those features. Maybe you're in initial implementation or full implementation, or you've been implementing for a while and you're trying to get innovated with your tier 2 systems. And then finally, you are implementing tier 2, you are solid, you are just trying to sustain. So if you could take a minute when you get a chance, pop over to polls and answer that question, that will kind of help us get a little background about you. So to kick it off, why tier 2? We know that approximately 10 to 15, upwards of 20% of students are going to need additional supports in addition to our tier 1 universals. And so it's really important that we have efficient and effective tier 2 and eventually tier 3 systems in place. We also know that half of lifetime cases of mental health conditions begin by the age of 14, and that 1 in 10 youth are going to be impacted by their mental health needs and require additional support at the school level. We also know, many of us very personally, that within our schools and within our districts, we don't always have an abundance of resources available to provide behavioral or mental health supports. So when we talk about tier 2 today, we want you thinking about identifying students early. We're going to talk about tier 2 as students who are at risk for engaging in problem behavior. And we're going to see if we can catch them early enough that we can prevent the problems from escalating and therefore use less intensive resources, as we know our resources are limited. So when we think about tier 2, we're going to talk about some critical features, get you oriented to what does a high quality tier 2 system look like. So we want you to recall, remember, emphasize that tier 2 is an extension of tier 1 implementation. Everything that we have built at tier 1 is going to become critical as we move up the continuum to tier 2. So we want you thinking about how strong is your tier 2 implementation. And Heather is going to walk us through that in a few minutes when we talk about tier 2 readiness. And we'll get into some concrete examples about how that builds upon each other. But I want you thinking about tier 2 as taking all of the practices that we've built at tier 1 and implementing them at higher levels, at more frequently and with more intensity for small groups of students. At tier 2, we're also going to talk about developing a standard student identification system. So if we're going to place students who are truly at risk in tier 2 interventions, how do we identify them early? And how do we make sure we're identifying all students that could potentially benefit from tier 2 interventions? We also, ultimate goal of tier 2 is that we have a standardized bank of research-based interventions. So when a student is identified, we've got this bank of readily available interventions. We can select, and we'll talk how to do that in a little bit, an intervention that's appropriate for this student, get them in quickly. And one of the goals of tier 2 is to prevent or decrease problem behavior. So we're going to talk through how does all of this look a little more in depth as we get into this session. One of the things that Heather and I and Chris and Holly are very aware of is in 75 minutes, we're not going to be able to go into super in depth about any of these critical features. So we're going to give you a lot of resources throughout this session today. In the files, Heather mentioned they're there. There's actually a resource document that has a ton of links for you to find out more information later. When we think about practices, we're going to talk about this within this continuum, but we want the tier 2 practices that we're selecting to be continuously and readily available at all times. One thing I want you to remember at tier 2 is these interventions are not individualized for each student. They're all small group interventions where all students that participate in the intervention get the same standardized intervention, and they're aligned to our school-wide expectations. This is that extension of tier 1. We're also going to do our best at tier 2 to match intervention to function. And we're going to select a small number of evidence-based tier 2 interventions that we know research shows are effective, and we're going to implement them well. So we're not going to overload our system and try to do a significant number of tier 2 interventions. We're going to think small and high quality. This graphic I know is hard to read in the Pathable screen or your Zoom screen. We'll be able to give you the full information, but this is Missouri Schoolwide Positive Behavior Support's student support model. And I love it because it's a visual representation of what the Tier 2 system looks like and how it builds off of Tier 1. So Heather's going to walk us through in just a second that Tier 2 readiness piece, but the first question I want you thinking about in this session, if you're considering building Tier 2 systems, is are we implementing Tier 1 with fidelity? Across our school-wide, non-classroom, and classroom settings, are we implementing all of those universal pieces well? If the answer is yes, then we're ready to move up to that Tier 2 continuum and begin to set up our student identification procedures, identify students, and move up the continuum. What I want you to remember from the Tier 2 overview piece is we are talking about identifying students who are at risk, engaging in low-level problem behavior. Our interventions are going to look the same across all students that are participating in them. We're not individualizing interventions at Tier 2. And we're really leaning heavy on our Tier 1 practices being implemented with fidelity and being strong. At Tier 2, we're not going to be conducting FBA, BIP at this level yet, but we are going to start thinking about function. So now that we've done that, I'm going to hand it back over to Heather. She's going to walk you through a little bit about Tier 2 readiness. How do we know if we're ready to begin Tier 2? And then we'll really start breaking down what does it look like.
Great. Thank you, Danielle. And as we head into this next section, I want to take a minute to also say in the files, you have two different ways to access this PowerPoint. You can access it as a PDF, as a note-taking document, but you also have the full PowerPoint with all of the slides and all of our talking points and notes. And within those notes for each slide, and for each section, we have very clear objectives, guiding questions, and tasks for you and your team to discuss and to participate in as you go through each of these pieces of Tier 2. Because as Danielle said, we know we cannot get into it at the level of detail that we might want to in a 75-minute session. So in this section, what we really want you thinking about is, are you ready to implement Tier 2? And are you going to be able to implement Tier 2 while maintaining your existing school-wide systems? And typically when we say that, we mean maintaining your existing Tier 1 systems. However, we know that we're in a very different climate right now, and so there are lots of school-wide systems that you're having to maintain, and really being deliberate about thinking about how to integrate Tier 2 with that and make sure that everything works together. All right. Oops, that's not. There we go. All right. So, first kind of question to ask yourself is, when is Tier 2 implementation appropriate? So, as Danielle mentioned, it really is anchored in Tier 1. We're not, at Tier 2, we're not introducing brand new practices. We're building off of the skills that we've already learned in Tier 1 and that we're already using in both non-classroom and classroom spaces. So what we then have to look at is, are we doing Tier 1 at fidelity and in a way that is making an impact, making the impact that we want to see on our students? So we'd like to hear from you. In the chat, would you please help us out and tell us what data sources do you use to monitor your Tier 1 PBIS or MTSS for behavior implementation? So I'm seeing things coming through already. ODRs, that's absolutely an option. TFI. So you guys keep brainstorming those. We'd love to hear that. So one of the things that we want to look at is high fidelity. 80% of students, or I'm sorry, 80% of 70 to 80% of the TFI items are in place. And then also looking at office disciplinary data, that 80% of our students have one or fewer office discipline referrals. Something to really focus on as you're looking at all of this is practices within the classrooms. So do you have a good sense of what teachers are doing with PBIS in your classroom settings, and are they implementing with fidelity? And then do you have the capacity on your campus within your district to engage in ongoing database decision making? It's really, really important as you move from tier 1 to tier 2. As important as data is in tier 1, it becomes even more critical in tier 2 as you're starting to look at monitoring for individual students or small groups of students. Okay, so really focusing on, do we have tier 1 solidly in place across all of our environments, and is it in place at a level that is impacting our students in the way that we want to see that impact across the building? And as always, be sure to look at those through the lenses of things like equity to make sure that everything is ready to go. The next thing that you want to think about is, all right, if we're ready for implementation, and how do we make some of those decisions? So one of the things that you can look at is starting to look at universal screening and your capacity for whether or not you have what the expectation is for the number of students that you might need to serve. So in general, if we think about the triangle, that middle level, 10 to 15% of our students might be in need of tier 2 services at any point in time. That's the expected base rate. When we talk about, this is what you might expect. You might have to serve up to that many students with tier 2. Beyond that, you want to think about what your actual base rate is. So within your own building, is it closer to 15% or is it closer to 5%? How do you determine that? Well, one of the ways that you can determine that is through data decision rules. So again, thinking about those database decision-making systems being in place, you want to look at things like attendance, office discipline referrals, achievement, to determine the number of students who you think need additional support. So you've got the expected base rate, which is that 10 to 15%. You've got your actual base rate, which is looking at your own data and determining what percentage of your students do you think need more than a tier 1 support. And then you need to think about, what is the serviceable base rate? And what we mean there is, given the resources you have at your disposal, how many students can you serve at tier 2, maintaining high implementation fidelity, maintaining tier 1, and all of the other pieces that are in play for you. So thinking through, your expected base rate is up to 15%. Your actual base rate might be closer to 8%. And then when you look at resources available to you, you may say, we're really only able to serve 4 to 6% of our students. And so then that becomes a question of, do you continue with tier 2 because you're within that range in terms of the number of students that you've got, or do you need to think about shoring up your school-wide systems? Do you need to think about shoring up your classroom systems, or are you ready to move on? All right. In addition, you want to then be able to talk with your building staff and your district about the appropriateness of tier 2, and having that information helps you to identify ways to build buy-in for the tier 2 implementation. All righty. Once you've decided to move forward with tier 2 implementation, let's see if we can get the slide. You'll need to start thinking about a tier 2 team. In the same way that you built a tier 1 team, we've got some parameters for who you want to be on this tier 2 team. Now, the tier 2 team for PBIS may be similar to other teams that you have in place in your building. So in chat, one of the things that we'd like for you to discuss is, who oversees small group academic interventions in your building or district? Is that handled by an individual? Is there a team? Are teachers participating on that team? Who's involved in deciding when students need additional academic intervention and how much intervention they need? Okay. So everything that Danielle and I have talked you through in terms of looking at tier 2 as an option for your building and determining whether you're ready is work that is done by some sort of leadership team or exploratory team at your building or district level. as we move forward, once you form this tier 2 team, a lot of the work will shift to them. And in order for that work to be done effectively and efficiently, we need to look at things like having members who have administrative authority and decision-making authority, as well as behavioral expertise and academic expertise. One of the things that we also want to make sure happens, because we've talked extensively at this point about the connection between tier 1 and tier 2, is that we want to make sure that there is someone who is on your tier 1 team who also sits on your tier 2 team to serve as a liaison between the two and make sure all of the initiatives are connected. Alrighty, so you've got a team in place. One of the first things your team needs to do is to think about what are the existing resources that you have in place for tier 2 implementation. So looking at your building level data, systems, and practices, what's already in place? Similar to what you may have done as you started tier 1, you took SAS and TFI data to help you determine what pieces you had in place, where you needed to build, where you needed to plug gaps. Same thing with tier 2. So here, the tools available to help you with that work are the tier 2 subscale on the TFI and the PBIS tier 2 systems readiness guide from the National Center. And you may also want to use a tool similar to the Hexagon tool, okay? The idea here, again, is to identify what you already have and what's already working so that you're not duplicating practices or systems and making sure that you can streamline your implementation. Once you've done that, you can move into some action planning with the tier 2 team. And so here, what we want to make sure you do is taking note of everything that's in place, determine what still needs to be built, what the timeline is for that, and who's going to be responsible for that. Tools available for that, again, relying on your data from the TFI and the other data that you've looked at. You've got lots of action planning templates available to you through the National Center, or you can look at Missouri's website or various other state level websites around the country. This will need to happen as a collaboration between your tier 2 team and your leadership team. Once you've got an action plan in place, you need to start thinking about training the rest of your building to implement, or training the rest of your team in terms of what all else needs to happen for tier 2 implementation. There are lots of training modules available, and we're curious to know what are your go-to professional development resources for PBIS. If you will share those in the chat with us. I'm going to turn it over to one of our exemplar presenters to talk a little bit about how they determine their readiness.
All right. Bear with me, some technical difficulties here. So as previously mentioned by Heather and Danielle, readiness for tier 2 begins with your tier 1 status. There's often a desire at the building level to expedite tier 2 interventions in response to disruptive behavior or some persistent learning error. And that's perfectly natural as a response, but a school should consider tier 1 fidelity. And here's why. And this may seem simple. It sounds silly to say to such an esteemed audience here, but a school never achieves a state of permanent tier 1 fidelity. Common sense, I know, and maybe you don't need that, but often behavior in our schools demonstrates something different about tier 1. Tier 1 systems and practices do require intentional maintenance and the monitoring to support more individualized student support, such as the tier 2 supports we'll talk about in greater depth. But for example, in terms of health and wellness, tier 1 practices may include diet or sleep habits. And no matter how specialized or intensive your exercise routine might be, if we fail to consider the nutritional value of our diet or the quality of our sleep, it does undermine or neutralize any expected health benefits we might realize. A second point to consider about readiness is that your tier 1 effectiveness is either going to serve as an enabler or a barrier to successful tier 2 interventions. I've had the opportunity to visit a number of schools that have been honored for their work with PBIS. And what stands out the most whenever I have visited a school that has been recognized for exemplary Tier 2 or Tier 3 implementation is their Tier 1 fidelity. You can feel it upon entering the building. It's everywhere. And for these schools, I would say that implementing at the Tier 1 level was not viewed by the faculty as some waypoint on the journey to some higher level. It really truly was the work. It provided the foundation for continuous improvement in the areas of academic, social, emotional, and behavioral wellness for the learning community. For most schools, that Tier 1 effectiveness will hinge upon a shared understanding and the collective commitments that you're able to forge with your faculty. So for example, has your school demonstrated clarity about school-wide expectations for student behavior, staff behavior, the instruction of behavioral expectations, and acknowledgement systems? I would say until the answer is yes, you may be wasting your staff's time, their talent, their energy in pursuit of a Tier 2 implementation. And one final thought to consider about Tier 2 readiness: the failure to maintain Tier 1 fidelity will compromise decision-making and problem-solving in your school. There's the old saying that a broken clock is right twice a day. And along those lines, if we consider a school climate or Tier 1, sometimes we can land on the right decision or action that supports a student, but because we lack the skill, the commitment, or Tier 1 fluency to produce some positive outcome for students, it can undermine our efforts. In my own history, I've had a lot of experience in the secondary level, and I see this at that level where it's very common for a student to find success in several settings, but a few settings or classrooms pose a significant challenge. So we have to ask, did the intervention fail? Was it inappropriate? And if we're not careful, and if our Tier 1 systems are not consistent, if they go unmonitored, we can draw inaccurate conclusions about the efficacy of Tier 2 interventions. When this happens, your school-wide student profile may suggest that more than 20 or 30% of students need a Tier 2 intervention. And if that's ever the case, our next best step is to revisit school-wide systems and practices and engaged in some database decision-making related to our Big Five. So
Hey, Chris.
Yes.
I apologize. This is Tim. Lots of the participants are having a hard time hearing you. I'm wondering if maybe you could get a little closer to your mic. Oh. Okay. Sorry for interrupting.
Okay. Well, I just finalized my thought there, so my apologies.
All right, Chris, thank you so much, and we'll have you closer to your mic for the next bit that you speak, the next bit of the presentation you've got. All righty, so now that we have a sense of readiness, the next thing that we want to get into is a quick overview of the practices, data, and systems that are associated with implementing Tier 2. Now, as Danielle said earlier, the other two sessions in this strand are focused on Tier 2 practices, so we're not going to spend very much time here. What we want you to think about here is that the critical features of Tier 2, while they're attached to Tier 1, are slightly different, and the same thing with Tier 3. So at Tier 1, we know that all of the practices associated with Tier 1 are universal, meaning we apply them to all students all the time in all of the spaces in our building. But they may be unique to that, they should be unique to that building and the culture and climate of the students in that building. They are offered to students on an ongoing and continuous basis. So again, all the time for all students. Now, when we get to Tier 3, we're very clear that those are individualized, unique to individual students, and they have to be developed from an FBA, or they are developed from a FBA BIP sort of process. What distinguishes Tier 2 interventions from Tier 1 and Tier 3 is that they are targeted. So they are not given to all students at all times, but they are not specific to an individual student. They're designed to meet the needs of a range of students in small groups. They're also standardized, so we're not having to build a new plan for every student who comes into Tier 2, and they're readily available for rapid implementation. All right, so we want to make sure that those different groups are distinguished, and we know that our Tier 2 systems and practices look a little bit different than Tier 1 and Tier 3, even though they are part of the continuum. That said, there are a set of common practices that we expect to see in Tier 2 systems. Very often, those include check-in, check-out, social skills groups, self-monitoring interventions, check and connect, things like first step, next. All right. All of these are, as you can see in this chart, matched to various functions of attention, and that's the standardization piece. So as students display a need for additional support, we attach it to a particular function of behavior and match them to an intervention accordingly. Again, the afternoon sessions in this strand will go into the practices in a lot more detail. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Danielle and let her talk to you about database decision making in Tier 2.
All right, thanks Heather and thanks Chris. So we have talked through big picture. What is Tier 2? How do we know if we're ready? Why is it important to implement Tier 1 with Fidelity? We've got checklists where you'll be able to assess that. I glanced at the polls and I see that the majority of you are at that exploration or initial implementation of Tier 2. And so we've also got an idea about what Tier 2 practices are and kind of what that vision looks like. Now we're really going to jump into database decision making. And we're going to talk about a lot of things in this section. And this will really start getting into what does it look like to build some of these Tier 2 pieces. So here I want you thinking about some questions in your head as we go through. How are we going to identify students early that need additional supports? How are we going to know which Tier 2 interventions the students that we've identified need? How will we know if the interventions are working and if we are implementing them with Fidelity? So those are some of the questions that we're going to work through in the database decision-making piece. So one of the first things that we're going to think about now that you've got your team, you've assessed readiness, you're ready to go, is how are we going to identify students early that need Tier 2 supports? So we want to have a clearly defined student identification plan that considers all students within our environment at the school or district level. And again, we're promoting early identification. We're truly trying to identify students who are at risk, who are just beginning to show risk so that we can catch it, get them in a standardized intervention and exit them from the intervention. At Tier 2, you've heard people say before, it's not a lifelong sentence. We're trying to get you in a Tier 2 intervention, get you some additional support when you start to show risk, and we're going to get you back out of the intervention, hopefully sooner rather than later. We also want our identification plan to identify students that are displaying internalizing behaviors, withdrawn, depressed, shy, anxious, as well as students who are displaying those more externalizing, talking out, blurting out, etc. So we want to have a comprehensive plan. As we start talking about student identification, drop in chat, some of you already are, thank you. How do you identify students that are in need of academic or behavioral supports right now? What does that look like? Ideally, you're going to be able to develop a comprehensive student identification plan. I am well aware that you likely cannot read any of the words on the picture on the screen right now, but you will be able to get a copy of this comprehensive student identification plan. But I'm going to walk through in just a second 3 different ways to identify students that may need Tier 2 supports. The idea is that when you decide which methods you're going to use, you're going to create a formalized plan that identifies your method of identification, the purpose or process of that, who's responsible for checking that data, and how you're going to use those results. So when we talk about identification at Tier 2, there's typically 3 different ways that we identify students early. I see many of these already popping up in your chat. The first is a nomination form. We often think about teacher nomination, but I encourage you to think about if parents or other stakeholders could nominate students that they're concerned about, and even if a student could nominate themselves if they have concerns. But we have a short nomination form where at any point during the school year, if I have a concern about a student, I can fill out a short, user-friendly form and submit it to a team who will then be able to have a conversation about the student and if they might need some additional supports. We ideally here think it's going to take 10 minutes or less for somebody to complete the form. It's not a packet of forms because we know that teachers are not likely to complete that even if they have concerns. So short, quick, easy to access nomination form where somebody can say, hey, I'm concerned about Tim. We're also going to have data decision rules. So within our setting, we're going to clearly articulate what are data pieces that we're going to monitor and what does at-risk look like in our setting. So I'm going to walk you through a couple examples here, and then Holly is going to talk a little bit about identification in a second as well. But you might decide office discipline referrals are one way that we can identify students. In our setting, if students have 0 to 1 office referrals, we're not overly concerned. But when a student hits 2 or more, that's a concern for us. We're going to flag them and immediately have a discussion about if a tier 2 intervention would benefit them. Or, you know, if a student's missed 5 or more, if they've been absent 5 or more times, we need to have a quick conversation. So we've got some data. When a student hits a data decision rule, we're going to immediately have a conversation about that student and if they would benefit from a tier 2 intervention. A third method for identification is a universal screening instrument. There are a variety of different instruments out there. Different schools, different districts use different tools. The idea with the universal screening instrument is that every student in the setting gets considered across a set of criteria. Teachers rate those criteria for that particular student, and then the data is reviewed. And we use that again to identify students that might be at risk. With all of these, there's nothing diagnostic about them. We're simply saying, hey, let's talk about this student. There might be some risk indicators. Let's see if a tier 2 intervention may be beneficial. What we want you to think about, comprehensive identification plan, all students get considered and we catch them early. So I'm going to turn it over to Holly, who is a principal at an elementary school in Fulton, Missouri, and she's going to talk to you for a few minutes about how they identify students for tier 2 supports in her setting.
Hi, everyone. So just a little bit of background is to that the building that I'm the principal of is a kindergarten through 5th grade building. And I guess I'll just kind of talk to you about what that student identification piece looks like for our school. Danielle talked a little bit about the nomination piece. What that looks like in my building is we have a request for assistance form. And once we have, it could be a teacher, it could be a staff, any staff member in the building. We take parent requests, we take student requests. Once there is a concern that's brought to the table, we ask that the teacher fill out this form. And like Danielle spoke about, it's nothing that's going to take the teacher more than 10 minutes. It is going to ask some important questions that the team needs to know. We do have a piece that talks about how is the student doing academically, how are, what anything that we need to know about the student, what externalizing and internalizing behaviors are being seen. We also do ask what previous interventions could have been used with this student. Maybe it's just something that the teacher has tried in the classroom. Did it work? Was it not effective? And then the team takes this and goes from there. So that's one of the methods that we use for identifying students for some extra supports from tier 2. And again, we take parent and student requests as well. Also, I wanted to talk about our data decision rules that we use once our tier 2 team has a student that has been nominated, someone has filled out the request for assistance, or perhaps we also have a set of rules that we use when we meet to talk about students that maybe haven't even been nominated yet. And so what we look at is we use SWIS to track our major office referrals as well as our minor office referrals. And a student that we might talk about would be a student that has 2 or more major office referrals or 6 or more minors, and we look at that within a 30-day period. Now, that does not mean that if somebody refers a student for assistance from the Tier 2 team, it doesn't mean that we're going to, not talk about them and not look at helping this student or providing that assistance, but that's our data decision-making rule as far as when we're looking at our data to look for students that could possibly use some assistance. I should say too that we don't require that those referrals be for the same behavior. So we might have a student that has one major office referral for defiance and maybe has another one for disrespect that we would take a look at. We also, when our Tier 2 team meets to kind of help us with this process, we use a pre-meeting organizer. So it kind of lays things out to help us make good decisions for our kids. And it also keeps us on track so that we're not wasting time talking about things that we don't need to talk about. And then as a team, kind of like Danielle mentioned earlier too, we are at a Tier 2 level trying to match one of those interventions to whatever we see as perhaps the function of the student's behavior. So, do we feel like from what information we have, are they really trying to seek peer attention? Are they trying to avoid work? Are they wanting to avoid adult attention? And we really, when we're trying to make decisions on the intervention and how we set that up, we're also thinking about student relationships that they have in the building. So one thing that we try to do for check-in, check-out, for check-in connect is we try to connect those students with an adult in the building that they have had a positive relationship with in the past, but we also look at who their next year teacher might be so that we can start building that relationship early, because a lot of times our students that need those interventions are students where that relationship is going to be very important. If someone could go to the next slide for me. The other thing I wanted to talk about was that universal screening piece. So there are multiple universal screeners out there. We happen to use Sabres and then MySabres. And what we have done is we have created a spreadsheet that we track the data. We look at the data from that, and we look at students, social behavior, academic, emotional, and we look at if they are, low risk, high risk. And typically what that looks like is we start by myself, our assistant principal, sit down with our counselors, and we go through this. And a lot of this data we use when forming some small group interventions. So I would, and we also, I want to say, the last thing I want to say about this is we do have a district PBIS team, and our district PBIS team is currently working on some data decision rules for our universal screener, so that, we have a better process for what we do as we're identifying students as being at risk.
Great, thank you so much, Holly. I know that people appreciate getting kind of an on-the-ground example of what this looks like. One question that came up in chat that I wanted to address and that Holly addressed as well is when we think about, I'm going to click back for a second, we think about multiple methods, how many methods should we have within our school to identify students? I think at an ideal setting, you heard Holly talk about how they utilize all 3 methods. So they have a nomination or request for assistance form, they've got data decision rules, and then they also use the Sabres universal screening instrument. We often urge schools to at least consider at a minimum 2 of the